Committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. Our job is to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the bureaucracy. In Congress, we hear every day from our constituents, Americans, their concern for their jobs and the lack of job creation. June figures show unemployment has remained unchanged at 8.2%. That means that 12.7 million Americans are unemployed, and far more have quit looking. Almost 42% have been unemployed for 6 months or more. The verdict is in. Keynesian economics, when applied the way the President's stimulus plan applied it, clearly will not work. Jobs created in the public sector for a year kept a job for a year, but did not create lasting employment in America, and certainly not in the private sector. For those of us who understand small business, it's our responsibility. For those of us who understand small business, they are responsible for over half of all job creation. Government can create an environment in which job creation is logical, desirable, and the goal of every small businessman. Or government, through its out-of-touch statements and actions, can create an uncertainty. That uncertainty, without a doubt, will cause small and not so small businesses to do the minimum and protect themselves from the downside. Today, that's what we see in America. Whether intended or not, this administration has created an environment of uncertainty, not just through regulations that are the creation of current legislation, not even the regulations from laws passed long ago, but in fact regulations coming out of thin cloth, coming out of places that no one knows where they came from. Legislation that was passed generations ago suddenly creating new and innovative requirements on business. Additionally, there has been a growth in the kind of non-regulation regulation, often called guidance or sometimes through executive order, that can come with no notice, can be just as compelling, just as draconian as any new piece of red tape coming from a long process with public comment. And then lastly, bureaucrats run amok. In this administration, bureaucrats seem to have an open door to simply do what they want to do, to say you must do something, or to delay a decision time and time again. Dates and mandates within the statute are often ignored, so when you ask for and you plan on starting production at a given date, it simply doesn't happen. This happened to Shell Oil in Alaska. It wasn't until hearings were scheduled, and virtually on the day, that they suddenly got a permit to start something for which they had lost at least one full season and countless millions of dollars. This and other pieces of red tape are part of the unintended consequences of an administration that gives only lip service to the word red tape. Only today, and I'll ask unanimous consent that the article be placed in the record, without objection so ordered, the White House launches new website in an effort to streamline regulations. I recognize this because, in fact, our committee launched that with little fanfare but the disdain of some in the administration that we would actually go out and actively ask trade associations and employers in America to tell us what the impediments to job creation were more than 2 years ago. We have more than 1,000 responses from that, and today I have instructed my staff to forward at least a sampling of those to the administration, to upload it to their website in the hopes that what they didn't seem to read for the last 2 years, they would read today. 44% of likely voters believe EPA regulations are hurting the economy, and 53% of registered voters say Federal regulations are one of the major reasons the economy is struggling. According to the National Federation of Independent Business, regulations and red tape are one of the single most important problems to small business. As a former small businessman, I know that to be true. Give me as few uncertainties, and I will be bold in every other way. Each uncertainty in a private business causes you to be less willing to take the other risks that occur every day in putting your own capital at risk in new and innovative products or programs. Today we will hear from a distinguished panel who live that nightmare. One of our challenges here on this committee is to get out enough to the field and to get people here that can tell us what they deal with every day in the heartland. I am pleased that our committee has held more field hearings to listen to more job creators than any of our predecessors since I have served in Congress. But it isn't enough. This hearing isn't enough. We have to go from this hearing to real regulatory relief, or the American people will continue to see the hundreds of billions of dollars that could be invested in new and innovative products, in new services, spent, in fact, on lawyers, accountants, and other people complying with regulations, and dollars will continue to pile up, not invested, but simply waiting for an opportunity and a certain environment. I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that agencies like the National Labor Relations Board, who took it on themselves to personally attack one of America's finest companies, our largest exporter, simply because they wanted to expand to a state that wasn't union-friendly to their liking. Ultimately, South Carolina did add those 3,000 jobs, and I have no doubt whatsoever that the Boeing plant there in the years to come will be doing just fine. With that, I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And one of the first hearings this committee held, this Congress, was a hearing much like this one. The title of the hearing was even similar, and I quote, "Regulatory Impediments to Job Creation," end of quote. I said then that an effective regulatory review should include several basic elements. It should examine both cost and benefits. It should base conclusions on solid data, and it should seek input from a wide variety of sources. 18 months have passed, but unfortunately, not much has changed. Today's hearing is the 29th hearing our committee has held during the Congress on the impact of regulations. Yet in every single one of those hearings, the committee's approach has been lopsided and unbalanced. The committee has focused on the cost of regulations without considering the benefits. The committee has solicited input only from witnesses who want to weaken or repeal regulations, but not those who wish to strengthen protections for children, small businesses, the economy, and American families. In these 29 hearings, the committee invited 107 witnesses to testify in favor of rolling back health, safety, and economic protections. We in the minority were left to bring some semblance of balance to those proceedings, but we were permitted to invite only 17 witnesses to provide alternative perspectives. Again, today, you invited 5 industry representatives to discuss their desire to weaken or repeal regulations. And we were allowed only a single witness to represent the other side of this important question. In May, the committee sent 187 letters, almost exclusively to industry organizations, asking for examples of regulations that, and I quote, "continue to negatively impact job growth," end of quote. These letters went to companies like ConocoPhillips and industry groups like the Society of Chemical Manufacturers and affiliates and the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. In response, these industry groups targeted a host of regulations that provide basic health and safety protection, such as child labor laws, standards for lead in children's toys, air and water quality standards, and lead paint renovation rules. But the committee sent no letters to organizations representing the other side, such as the American Academy of Pediatrics or other children's advocacy groups that could testify about the benefits of those rules and how children could be harmed by weakening them. Of course, the Chairman has every right to conduct this committee's activities as he sees fit. But in my opinion, the committee loses credibility when its actions are so blatantly and explicitly one-sided. And losing that credibility means the American public is less likely to take our results seriously. In the committee's letter, the Chairman referred to a, quote, regulatory tsunami, end of quote. That, and continuing the quote, that does not appear to be slowing down. If this is a tsunami, then I wonder what a drought looks like. OMB data shows that the current administration has approved fewer rules than in either of President Bush's terms. A report published last month by Public Citizen found that 78% of the rules with statutory deadlines last year were not, in fact, issued by the statutory deadline, and that OMB's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs is taking longer to review the rules than ever before. It is kind of inaccurate rhetoric that drives the constant stream of anti-regulatory legislation considered by the House this Congress. Next week, the House will consider legislation to prevent Federal agencies from issuing regulations until the unemployment rate is under 6%. This bill does not make any sense. Why in the world would you take a regulation to protect children from toxic chemicals, for example, and prevent it from taking effect until the national employment rate reaches some arbitrary threshold? The problem is that the Republican approach is based on a faulty premise that regulations kill jobs. This myth has been widely discredited by economists on both sides of the aisle. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a report issued in April by the Institute for Policy Integrity entitled The Regulatory Red Herring.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The role of job impact analysis in environmental policy debates. This report found that the current rhetoric linking regulations to job losses is indeed misleading. Mr. Chairman, the time has come for Congress to change course and to focus on reality instead of myths and inaccurate rhetoric. We need to work together to conduct legitimate oversight that is focused on creating jobs and protecting the health and safety of American families. We can indeed do both. We do not have to choose one or the other. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I now ask unanimous consent that the committee's report be placed in the record. Without objection, so order. And as a point of personal privilege, I suspect that the ranking member in his opening statement was not objecting to any breach of protocol, since one witness at most was, and often not one witness, is what we received when we were in the minority. The gentleman was not implying that Mr. Towns, when he was in the majority, treated the minority any differently, is he?
No, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking for the day when I become the chairman, and we'll make sure that we have that balance.
I'm looking forward to the day in which a chairman in your party somehow does allow more than one witness. With that, I recognize the subcommittee chairman, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your continued leadership, focusing this committee's efforts on the plight of job creators struggling to survive under a mountain of red tape. The Subcommittee on Regulatory Affairs has held 10 separate hearings and listened to job creators from across the country to better understand what is stopping them from putting more Americans back to work. We held these hearings because, like you, we know that it is not the Federal Government that creates jobs. Rather, it's the small business entrepreneur who is responsible for over 50% of job creation in this great country. Most of our constituents are not employed by Fortune 500 companies. Rather, they are employed by the local restaurant, manufacturers, or home builders whose CEO is part of the community and one of their neighbors. These folks tell me that they are not hiring any more workers because of the regulatory uncertainty created by this administration. I've heard from folks in the manufacturing industry explain that it is the never-ending cascade of EPA regulations that drive up the cost of energy, eliminating their competitive advantage over foreign manufacturers. I've heard from truck drivers who have every incentive to maximize fuel efficiency and driver safety tell me that the DOT and the EPA are putting them out of business with their multiple mandates that impose a great cost with very little return in benefits. While the President may be trying to convince himself that the private sector is just fine, constituents in Ohio and across the country know firsthand that this is just not the case. And so, again, I want to thank you for this hearing. And if I could, Mr. Chairman, I know the very first hearing this committee held, this Congress, January of 2011, we had 5 small business owners from around the country come in and speak. One happened to be from our district, Jack Busher. Busher Electric started his company 30 years ago, successful, but he was just like the other 4 on that committee. And it was a great hearing, about 3 hours. But if you remember, Mr. Chairman, I think the most compelling question came at the end of that hearing, where a colleague of ours, who is not here today, Mr. Genta, asked a simple question. He said to the 5 witnesses who were there that day, he said, "Gentlemen, I just want to know one thing. You've all been in business 25, 30 years, 35 years, successful leaders in your community, like many of the folks, or like the folks we have with us today." He said, "I just want to know one thing. If you knew then what you know now, would you have started?" I mean, it was just, again, a question that cut right to the heart of the matter. If you knew back then all the hoops and the hassles and the hurdles and the obstacles and the baloney the government was going to make you deal with, would you, in fact, have been that entrepreneur, taken the risk, started your business, taken out that loan, worked and struggled like you did to create this business, employ people, and become a leader in your community and someone who helps a lot of families? Would you have done it all over again? And if you remember the response, Mr. Chairman, every single one of those witnesses said, "I don't think I'd have done it." And if that is not a sad indictment on the greatest country in the world, that we are making it that difficult for entrepreneurs to start a business and create jobs and help their community and help our country, I don't know what is. And so, again, I want to thank you for your efforts and the efforts of this committee in focusing on this issue of red tape and the regulatory burden that faces so many of our job creators and small business owners out there. It's entirely appropriate. And with that, I would yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'd be happy to yield.
Just one question. Do you remember in these over 100 witnesses them being interested in eliminating safety or somehow rolling back the health and protection in any of their complaints on regulations, not even once?
Not even once, Mr. Chairman. And in fact, as you well know, and as these, I'm sure our witnesses will testify to today, employers are focused on safety because they understand the value that their employees bring to their business and the value and quality that they add to their product or to their service. And so they get that simple fact. It's unfortunate that some in government don't understand that basic phenomenon. Gentleman,
The gentleman yield for
be happy to yield. The gentleman from Tennessee.
Just because I like simple math, there was an observation made about the fairness of the folks that were pro-regulation, anti-regulation in terms of witnesses. I think we had 170 or so witnesses that were here that complained about regulations and 17 who were in favor of regulations. In my job creators tour around Tennessee's 4th, I went to about 40 businesses, and I was sitting there going through my head, and these were businesses that had unions and otherwise. Only 4 did not complain about regulations, and for my simple math, that's 10%. So I think maybe the proportion of witnesses in this case happened to work out fine. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his point and yield back to the Chairman.
I thank the Chairman. Does anyone else seek recognition? And with that, we will now introduce our esteemed panel. We'd like to welcome Mr. Paul Urazi. He is Urazi. Thank you. He is President of HNTB Holdings Limited in New York City. He has been testifying on behalf of the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. I think that was one of the groups we asked if there were impediments to job creation. Mr. Jim Hamby is Chief Executive Officer of Vision Bank in Ada, Oklahoma, a place I was fairly near not too long ago, like this past weekend, for meeting with job creators. Mr. Billy Perkle is Senior Director of Environmental Health and Safety of Crop Production Services, Inc. in Loveland, Colorado. He is testifying on behalf of the Agricultural Retailers Association. Mr. Howard Williams is Vice President and General Manager of Construction Specialties, Inc. in Muncie, Pennsylvania. Mr. Steve Russell is Vice President of Plastics Division of the American Chemistry Council here in Washington, D.C., one of the organizations we often go to for facts and figures on industry. And Mr. Barry Ruttenberg is the owner of Barry Ruttenberg and Associates, Inc. in Gainesville, Florida. He is testifying on behalf of the National Association of Home Builders. Pursuant to our rules, I would ask you all to rise, raise your right hand to be sworn. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth? Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. Please be seated. Now, thanks to C-SPAN, every time I say this, I get to smile because you all know how this works. There's lights in front of you. They will be, there's a countdown clock. They're going to go green, yellow, red. When they're green, say anything you want to say, whether it's included in your prepared statement or not. When it turns yellow, the way Mr. Lankford probably would describe it, hurry up and don't get caught underneath the red light in the intersection. When it gets to red, if you haven't finished up, please go to that last page where you say in summation and make it short. It's a large panel today. We're very happy to have all of you, but we would like to get to the questions on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Urasi.
Thank you. Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the subcommittee, I'm Paul Urasi, President of HNTB Holdings. I'm here today representing the American Road Transportation Builders Association. ARTBA, now in its 110th year of service, represents all sorts of U.S. transportation construction industry, all of the sectors which sustains more than 2.2 million American jobs. ARTBA recognizes Federal regulations play a vital role in the fabric of our society. In the transportation area, they provide a sense of predictability and ensure a balance between meeting our nation's mobility needs and protecting the public interest. We commend Congress that acted in a bipartisan manner to improve the transportation project delivery process by cutting red tape in the recently enacted transportation bill. However, in other areas, Federal regulations hinder rather than help achieve the balance that we need. One of these instances is the recently enacted Federal rules governing the hours of service for commercial truck drivers may work. These rules are designated to ensure long-haul drivers do not drive to the point of exhaustion by spending too much time on the road. Transportation construction industry drivers are not long-haul operators who consistently spend many consecutive hours on the road in a given day. Generally, transportation construction industry commercial drivers do not operate in a manner that leads to concerns over fatigue. At the same time, transportation project owners, the driving public, and commercial shippers expect contractors to build projects in a timely and efficient manner with minimum disruption to traffic. In addition, the industry is also using innovative techniques to replace a bridge or a roadway, working intensively in a concentrated period of time, like over a single weekend. This situation is a prime example of applying a one-size-fits-all regulatory approach. While windows of 10 to 11 hours of drive time and 13 to 16 hours of on-duty time may seem adequate in other cases, in fact, those limitations can disrupt the efficient deployment of professionals and resources on construction job sites without a demonstrated increase in safety. Further increased costs would otherwise support capital and personal expansions. Another area of concern for our group is EPA's draft guidance that would greatly expand the reach of the Clean Water Act. In this undertaking, EPA is proposing a significant expansion of the Federal jurisdiction over wetlands, and doing so in a manner that bypasses the opportunity for my industry and other affected interests to provide input. Chief among our substantive concerns with this proposal is roadside ditches, which would be subject to Federal wetlands requirement. This is both unnecessary and potentially damaging to the transportation construction industry. Virtually every road or roadway improvement project in the U.S. has a ditch associated with it. As such, the EPA plan could provide that agency with an approval role in most, if not all, future roadway improvements. Notwithstanding the lack of viability of such a plan, it would inject major uncertainty and delays in the delivery of transportation benefits. If members of my industry are stuck in a continuing labyrinth of bureaucratic wetland approvals, they will be unable to make decisions about allocating existing personnel, let alone future hires. Chairman Mica and other leaders of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee have introduced a measure which would stop the EPA proposal. We would urge members of this committee to support that legislation. Finally, EPA has indicated it is evaluating whether or not to regulate coal ash as a hazardous substance. Coal ash is commonly used in materials such as concrete, which is a key component of transportation infrastructure improvements. Further, EPA has routinely noted the benefits of recycled coal ash in the transportation arena and its safety. Reversing course and designating coal ash as a hazardous material would remove the valuable tool of my industry efforts to create efficient U.S. transportation network at the lowest possible cost. Our study has found that will cost our industry more than $104 billion over the next 20 years. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, ARTBA deeply appreciates this opportunity to present testimony to you on this important issue. I look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you. Mr. Hamby.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, Congressman Langford, members of the committee, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak today. I'm the President and Chief Executive Officer of Vision Bank in Ada, Oklahoma, and it's a community bank. I want to thank you for inviting me to testify, and I want to thank this committee for its willingness to address the issues of how regulatory red tape is impeding job creation. Like most community banks, Vision Bank is deeply involved in every aspect of the communities we serve. We've been helping our small business partners grow now for over 100 years. These include businesses, farmers, ranchers, oil and gas company, Indian tribes, doctors, hospitals, and anything that walks in the door. We've helped create thousands of jobs, and we sponsor a lot of things, some of which are, right now we're doing a financial literacy program for students in 13 high schools in our district, where we are providing financial literacy training for each one of those and helping them meet curriculum requirements so they'll be productive citizens. We also donated over $420,000 last year to assist local charity groups and organizations, and this equals about 8% of our income. These accomplishments are the essence of what a community bank does, and I am very proud to be a community banker. Vision Bank is also a small business, and we can't lose sight of that. We're locally owned, and we employ more than 200 people, all of which have great futures. We provide health care, life insurance, health benefits, retirement plans, and we're really a family. Most small businesses are. Community banks like mine pride themselves on being quick to adapt. But at some point, it gets very hard to handle it. We understand the need for regulations to protect safety and soundness of our bank. We understand regulations that protect the consumer. And we're in favor of those regulations. We're the highest regulated industry in the world, and we need a lot of regulations. We agree that our customers should be protected. To do this, regulations are a large part of our business. But we're now facing 10 times the number of rules than we did just 10 years ago. 50 of these rules were new in the 2 years before Dodd-Frank. And with Dodd-Frank, there are now 4,000 pages of proposed rules and more than 4,000 pages of final rules. The new laws or regulations might be manageable by themselves, but we're dying a death of 1,000 paper cuts. Wave after wave of new rules, one on top of another, are overwhelming many small community banks and making it harder for us to do what we do best, which is meet the credit needs of our local communities. I'm going to give you a few staggering statistics. At Vision Bank, our compliance costs have increased $1.4 million in the last 3 years, and those are hard numbers. That represents a 29% decrease in our profits. That means 29% less taxes. That means 29% less in capital formation, which helps supports lending. This includes more than the cost of hiring and training of new compliance personnel and systems. It also includes something that you cannot quantify, and that's the lost opportunities that result when money that would normally be devoted to making loans and consumers and small businesses is instead spent on outside consultants, lawyers, and so forth, not to mention the fact that it causes us to take our eye off the ball and spend most of our time trying to comply with new regulations instead of getting out and meeting the customer. The more resources we devote to regulatory compliance, the fewer resources we have to meet our communities. Every dollar spent on regulatory compliance means as many as $10 less available for credit-worthy borrowers. Less credit means businesses can't grow and create jobs. As a result, local economies suffer, and the national economy suffers as well. One example of unnecessary compliance burden, and it's a small example, is the outdated requirement that ATMs include potential fee notices on the screen and on the machine itself. Originally, you couldn't put it on the screen, so the law said to put it on the machine. Well, the main contribution of this rule today is to encourage frivolous lawsuits and to force banks to spend valuable time and resources scurrying around, updating all of our ATMs to make sure that fee notification stickers haven't been removed by vandals, even though the screen discloses and asks what the fees are and asks you if you want to proceed or not. I'm grateful that the House last week passed legislation to remove this duplicative requirement, and it's a minor one. Another example is the requirement that banks re-notify customers of their privacy policies every year if a bank hasn't made any changes to their policies. I can understand if you're changing policies with them, but when you're not, it's a large expense and it takes a lot of money. Under Dodd-Frank, the proposed qualified mortgage exemption or the ability to repay rule is unnecessarily complicated, and its potential to make it much more costly for banks, especially small banks, to make loans. The QM exception alone could force banks to deny loans to creditworthy customers. Likewise, provisions on municipal advisors is problematic in itself and would limit important services that banks provide to municipalities. As regulatory burdens like these increase, banks like mine find it hard to meet the needs of our local communities. I'm really worried about the health of small banks. The average bank is $165 million, the average community bank. Our profits at $550 million were decreased by 30%. I would imagine likewise theirs would decrease 40 to 50%. If this trend continues, there are also companies, they have shareholders. My fear is that shareholders look at the profitability of it and the future of it, and they tell them it's time to sell. And when a small town loses its community bank with its local ownership, that's a tragedy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Perkle.
Thank you, Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee. My name is Billy Perkle. I'm the Senior Director of EHS, or Environmental Health and Safety, for Crop Production Services. We're an ag retailer, and I'm also the Chairman of the Ag Retail Association. I'm here to represent the ag retailer. The ag retailer is a small business with employees of around 5 to 15 in a rural agricultural area. ARA and ag retailers are concerned with regulatory actions by EPA. We believe that some of these cause unnecessary financial burden to our industry. I'll give a specific incident that occurred to us and to some ag retailers as well. But at the same time, I understand the comments about being resistant to regulatory change. But I think our industry has shown that we love to participate and actually applaud the efforts of EPA as we participated and supported the pesticide container containment rule that was passed in 2006. One of the things that we actually are experiencing some change in interpretation of the rule that is creating a burden is under EPCRA. In EPCRA, which was passed in 1986 and then clarified in 1987, there was EPA correctly articulated an interpretation of the intent of a fertilizer retail exemption. It says, because the general public is familiar with the application of agricultural chemicals as part of common farm, nursery, livestock production activities and the retail sale of fertilizers, there is no community need for reporting of the presence of these products. In the reference that was placed there into the regulation under Section 311E5. Retailers are exempted from reporting requirements for fertilizers only. Therefore, substances sold as fertilizers would not need to be reported. However, the agricultural chemicals such as pesticides would need to be reported. In the last few years, EPA has actually visited ag retailers and cited them for not reporting fertilizers. There were actions taken, fines and penalties paid to resolve these issues, where the ag retailer felt like that they did report their Tier 2s, they did report the products as directed by EPA, and they were in compliance with those. However, due to some guidance or reinterpretation by EPA, these ag retailers lost the exemption and it cost them monies. One of the things that's also occurring that EPA is actually under the SID codes for the ag retailer, they typically fall under 5191, which is a farm wholesale supplier. Many EPA agencies are now recognizing or actually identifying or reclassifying ag retailers as manufacturers under the SID code of 2875. If EPA continues to reclassify ag retailers as manufacturers, it does place additional regulatory burden on the ag retailers in the amount of somewhere around $30,000 per location, with an annual update burden of around $6,000. The second point I'd like to highlight is the Clean Water Act pesticide permits. EPA has developed a general national pollution discharge elimination permits in response to Sixth Circuit Appeal Court's decision in the National Cotton Council versus EPA. In this case, there actually was clarification direction given to ag retailers and farmers that they would need to get an MPDS permit to apply pesticides to waters of the states. These products were already be permitted or a label approved by EPA through FIFRA, and we see this to be duplicate of effort and also probably differencing of opinion from the FIFRA group and the Clean Water group. This differences of opinions or actual approvals will cause confusion to the ag community and unnecessary burden as well. In summary, we applaud your efforts here to hear our testimonies, and we ask you to continue to hold these regular oversight meetings, and we ask Congress to look into legislative action to prevent EPA to continually give guidance rather than regulations, and we look forward to answering any questions you might have.
Thank you, and we will. Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, staff, representatives. In the early 20th century, cyanide used as a fumigant was as likely to kill the neighbors as it was the vermin. And in the secret history of lead, we knew, our Surgeon General knew, and the manufacturers of the gasoline or additive knew in 1922 that gasoline would leave behind particulates of lead which in small doses would affect human health. And yet the Federal Bureau, studying that aspect with interest, chose to leave the word lead out and chose not to have any press releases because the word lead would cause excitement in the newspaper headlines. Ultimately, the word ethyl was used, and again, because leaving lead out would leave the public somewhat blind as to what was in the gasoline additive. At that time, national gasoline sales were 8 billion gallons per year, and the additive ethyl, if it gleaned 20% market share, would bring in approximately $40 million per year in net profit. Lead was outlawed as an additive here in 1986. And as we leave 1922 and move forward 90 years in an advancing society, we see the Chicago Tribune's article, 4-part series on flame retardants. And again, we see scary headlines and the need for regulation. My understanding from a news release yesterday is that the EPA is investigating those allegations. And as I repeat a comment that I made in my February testimony, a thriving free market economy self-regulates demand, supply, and price but it does not uniformly or equitably regulate health, safety, or environmental responsibility. The invisible hand of the free market does not naturally yield to the good of the whole, but regulation is a necessary balance, and spirited debate such as this is its necessary counterbalance. Fred Knapp, in writing for The Hill, cites several independent survey findings showing that a weak economy is more rooted in customer demand and concerns over that economy, and that the 2011 U.S. Chamber of Commerce survey showed that 8% of the respondents, only 8% of the respondents said too much regulation was a cause. I manage a manufacturing division in central Pennsylvania. We make architectural building products. Our business, as all businesses, of course subject to regulation, but all of our investment decisions, and our company dates back to 1948. We are privately held. All of our decisions for investment are based on market research, solid market research, and it is on that we make our decisions, not on whether some aspect of that work is regulated or not regulated. In this economy, we are blessed to have added jobs in spite of the doubtful economy that we have been in. Since 2008, July of 2008, we have added 94 jobs to our facility, and we have invested in a startup that has now 29 other jobs, millions of dollars invested in that startup. Investments in workplace safety, trade and commerce, and environmental aspects have resulted in our success within the marketplace. Our customer demand is what raises our bar, much higher than Federal or State regulation may raise it, because we are subject to the direction of the customer. In his 1961 farewell address, President Eisenhower said, "Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience, the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without asking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow." Regulation is a necessary balance because the invisible hand of the free market does not naturally or even willingly yield to the good of the whole. Business growth and jobs creation will continue to be rooted in the basics of market demand. Business growth by deregulation has the potential to externalize costs that were otherwise covered at the point of origin. Business gains from deregulation will not likely be shared with the America of tomorrow, and we will have done what President Eisenhower warned us against. We will have mortgaged the material assets of our grandchildren because we chose to live for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure he wasn't talking about a $1 trillion deficit, but Mr. Russell.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, good morning. My name is Steve Russell. I'm the Vice President of the Plastics Division at the American Chemistry Council. ACC thanks you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. ACC represents companies in the business of chemistry. Our members apply the science of chemistry to make innovative products that make people's lives healthier, better, and safer. The business of chemistry is a $760 billion enterprise and a key element of our nation's economy. Our industry is one of the nation's largest exporters, accounting for 10 cents out of every dollar of U.S. exports, and we are among the largest investors in research and development. In response to the committee's request for information, ACC pointed out 5 areas where regulatory burdens are impeding our nation's economy and hurting jobs in our industry. Those areas included chemical assessment processes and certain air regulations. I'm here today to highlight another example, the General Services Administration's decision to designate a single Green Building Rating System, LEED, as the standard for Federal agencies and departments. LEED is one of several private sector green building systems which are helping to drive reductions in the energy use in both public and private sectors. To be absolutely clear, ACC supports this broad objective. We have supported laws and regulations to increase energy efficiency. We and several of our members are members of LEED. In fact, our own building here in Washington is LEED certified silver. Our concern is that the GSA has given its stamp of approval to only LEED, and LEED is currently being revised in a way that would jeopardize U.S. jobs and our industry's competitiveness, not to mention building performance and efficiency. This matters to ACC, and it should matter to the committee, because many of the construction materials that our industry manufactures are essential to the insulation, roofing, windows, and sealants that allow buildings to achieve the kind of efficiency and savings critical to reducing environmental impacts and ensuring a sustainable future. GSA's selection of LEED is damaging for several reasons, but I would like to highlight three. First, by picking a single rating system, GSA effectively creates a monopoly for Federal buildings. Building rating systems function as standards, and there are various standards available to the Federal Government. When the entire Federal Government picks just one private standard, then competition, the engine that drives lower prices, greater efficiency, higher quality products, is removed. Once a standard captures the entire market, there is no competition and no incentive to keep the price of implementing that standard down. So in the end, the taxpayer pays more. In this case, GSA continues to award a monopoly to LEED, and the committee should urge GSA to instead construct performance-based criteria for selecting green building rating systems, and then accept any private standard that meets the designated performance criteria. Second, regulations and standards adopted by agencies should be data-driven and science-based. Federal agencies can't avoid obligations to make regulatory decisions based on science by simply adopting a private standard that is not based on science. Yet this is unfortunately what GSA is doing. Recently proposed LEED updates are so weakly grounded in science that the system would give a credit for avoiding proven U.S.-made products. These products include energy-efficient foam insulation and cool vinyl roofing, such as the recently installed vinyl roof at the DOE headquarters. This regulation, or this credit, would also restrict the ability of the Federal Government to use shatter-resistant polycarbonate glass, such as this example here, which is essential in protecting buildings such as courthouses, government institutions, and prisons from bullets. As you can see, a bullet has been shot into and remains impregnated in the unshattered glass. Because credits such as these are not adequately justified by science or data, GSA should not recommend LEED for Federal buildings if these and similar credits remain. And finally, GSA is wrongly giving preference to building standards that could hurt the competitiveness of small American businesses. For example, under a proposed chemical avoidance credit in the current version, small U.S. manufacturers of building materials will have to certify that their materials comply with complex European regulations so that the builders can obtain a credit, imposing additional costs for U.S. small manufacturers if they wish to compete. A different proposed credit requires materials to be screened against a cumbersome tool developed by an environmental NGO, which adds unnecessary costs not easily borne by small domestic manufacturers. Of course, if compliance with the European requirement is a function of the LEED standard, U.S. manufacturers could decide that the compliance cost is too high and exit that market. ACC sincerely appreciates the committee's interest in working on regulations that hinder job and economic growth, and we urge you to ask GSA to recommend instead science-based, performance-based green building rating systems that reduce costs to businesses and save jobs. Thank you, the committee, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Ruttenberg.
Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, member of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Barry Ruttenberg, a home builder from Gainesville, Florida, and NAHB's 2012 Chairman of the Board. On behalf of the 140,000 members of the National Association of Home Builders, I want to thank you for holding this hearing on streamlining Federal regulations. NAHB members have daily interaction with scores of Federal regulations and know firsthand how the regulatory process impacts small businesses. I want to highlight a few of those regulations now, but my written testimony contains much more detail on these and other burdensome regulations. I might add that recent studies show that the cost of regulations is 25% or more of the cost of a home. This year, regulators may make decisions that will determine the future shape of the secondary mortgage market. Dodd-Frank authorized significant changes to mortgage lending practices, including the ability to repay standard, which is part of what is called a qualified mortgage. as well as risk retention and qualified residential mortgage provisions, which will determine the future shape of the secondary mortgage market. NAHB supports regulatory changes aimed at more rational lending practices, greater lender accountability, and improved borrower safeguards. It is critical that mortgage lending reforms are implemented in a manner that causes minimum disruption. A housing finance system that provides adequate and reliable credit to homebuyers at reasonable interest rates through all business conditions is critical to our nation's economic health. Overly restrictive rules will prevent willing, creditworthy borrowers from entering the housing market, even as owning a home remains an essential part of the American dream. Another key factor in housing's current depressed state has been confusion over the issue of acquisition, development, and construction lending. Our members are frequently caught in an argument between banks and regulators who take turns pointing fingers at each other for the lack of lending to the construction sector. We seek answers as to whether Federal banking regulators are pressuring the banks or if institutions are overhauling and downsizing portfolios independent of regulator and examiner pressure. A significant source of frustration in the remodeling sector is EPA's lead renovation, repair, and painting rule. Renovation work that disturbs more than 6 square feet in a pre-1978 home is required to follow new lead-safe work practices supervised and performed by an EPA-certified renovator. These requirements do not apply if tests show an older home does not have lead paint present. However, currently available test kits have false positive rates as high as 78%. While EPA has indicated that it is committed to having more accurate kits, consumers are paying additional costs for unnecessary work practices. EPA also removed an opt-out provision for households living in pre-1978 homes that do not have young children or a pregnant woman. EPA estimated removing the opt-out would increase costs to small businesses by $507 million. Legitimate small contractors will be forced to pass on these costs, increasing the likelihood that homeowners will turn to uncertified contractors who may not follow the rules. NHB is also concerned about the Department of Justice's interpretation of the Lacey Act, which seeks to prevent trade in protected plants and animals. Under the Lacey Act, Congress sought to exempt honest business owners and instead provided the U.S. government more targeted tools to go after intentional violators. The U.S. Department of Justice, however, has virtually eliminated this important defense for honest business owners through a broad misinterpretation of the law. By deeming Lacey violation wood and plant products contraband, innocent companies are left without legal standing to challenge a government taking in court. Coupled with the requirement that the U.S. government enforce an almost limitless set of foreign laws, builders and ultimately consumers are left at great risk. Therefore, NAHB supports Representative Cooper's bill, H.R. 3210, the Retailers and Entertainers Lacey Implementation and Enforcement Fairness Act, or RELIEF Act, which recognizes the need to hold harmless those who knowingly are found to be in possession of products that run afoul of the Lacey Act. NHB is encouraged that the targeted common sense reforms included in this legislation will address these concerns, and we thank Majority Leader Cantor for including this legislation in the schedule. Again, we appreciate the opportunity to testify today and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I recognize myself for a round of questioning. If we could have the first slide up, I just want to make some point to make this at least understood to be as bipartisan an effort as it is. This is the source is the Office of Management Budget, Obama administration. It says, there is some evidence that domestic environmental regulation has led to some U.S.-based multinationals to invest in other countries, especially in the domain of manufacturing. And it goes on. Next slide, also from the Office of Management Budget, says, regulations can also impose significant costs on business, dampening economic competition and capital investment. The next slide says, again, Office of Management and Budget, Obama administration, regulations can place undue burdens on companies, consumers, and workers, and may cause growth and overall productivity to slow. If I had more than 5 minutes, I'd go on for another 5+ minutes with examples where this administration has said repeatedly that, in fact, regulations can cost jobs. But let me just, I think, I'll look at the home builder example, I'm sorry, look at the LEED certification example for a moment. I own a LEED certified silver building. It doesn't have GSA in it. It has a tenant in it that invested several $1,000,000 in redoing the building to meet that standard. And it's a wonderful building. But let me ask a couple of quick questions. The GSA doesn't pay for TIs. My understanding is they want everything included in the rent, including the utilities. Isn't that correct?
Yes, Congressman.
So when the GSA puts a mandate on taking a half a building, a quarter of a building, or an entire building, aren't they, in fact, in a sense, driving up the cost to the taxpayer of capital improvements that may be for as few as, well, in the cases of the census that was in my building for less than a year, they can, in fact, be in there for just 1 year. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
So let's go through this. The GSA only has one basic way they like to contract for leased facilities, which is they like to have an all-in strategy. They're telling you to upgrade the utilities, upgrade all of these items, when in fact they may be a partial tenant and only in there for a short period of time. There may be no cost benefit. But even if there was a cost benefit, isn't it true that since they're not paying the utilities, they're in fact already encouraging the building owner to make the changes that are in their best interest to drive down the cost of those utilities?
That's absolutely correct.
So they're just not protecting the taxpayer once again.
Well, we feel as many benefits as energy-efficient, high-performing buildings provide, the question of how the Federal Government goes about mandating the use of a particular system to get there removes the competition, artificially inflating the cost of having that green building meet higher performance standards.
But I guess what we need is maybe a conference, bring all the GSA people together to discuss how they could do this better. I think they've had one recently. I'm not sure if they have another one planned right now.
Would the Chairman yield on that, Mr. Chairman, for a friendly observation?
Of course.
I would welcome such a suggestion because there's another aspect of this, and that is GSA practices when a long-term lease is expired. It exerts the right to stay nonetheless until it finds a new location, and that has enormous impact on the owner of a building in terms of financing costs because it's caught in limbo, and it can actually put a company out of business, depending on how many buildings they own. So some of the practices being deployed right now by GSA are, to me, very injurious to business interests. I thank the Chair for yielding.
And the gentleman knows, because he has probably more GSA contracted space than probably any other member of Congress. Mr. Russell, I'm going to stay on this subject and let others go to other subjects. When we look at GSA, both this committee and other committees of jurisdiction, if GSA came in and said, we'd like you to meet LEED standards and other standards, we'd like you to embrace these, but we want you to do it in a transparent, cost-effective way, I'm assuming that your members would be thrilled to run an analysis of energy savings, cost, capital improvements, and so on, so that it would be transparent as to whether in that one-year lease it made sense to upgrade or the best value for the taxpayer for a short or part of a building lease might be less, something that currently I understand is not in the bidding process.
That's correct, Chairman. If I may,
of course.
Our members manufacture the kinds of products that allow buildings to achieve their highest performance. Innovation is at the core of our industry, and the innovative potential of the chemistry industry to deliver the kinds of tools that we need to increasingly improve is at risk because of GSA's continued selection of only one system rather than setting high bars and letting different systems meet that standard. We would, of course, be in favor of having GSA select performance-based criteria and then encouraging competition in how to reach them, which would in turn increase transparency among the various systems and the various materials.
Speaking of transparency, that piece of what we often call bulletproof glass that you held up, my understanding is that's what the President stands behind in order to be protected, something either identical or substantially similar.
That's correct.
Well, I'm certainly hopeful that GSA understands that we all, when appropriate, want to have that kind of protection, and if it doesn't meet somebody's environmental questions, I would still say life savings comes in all forms. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for his round of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here, and I appreciate everything that you've said. Mr. Hamby, I understand what you're talking about. And with regard to the banks and our community banks, we see the results of regulations in that, and I've seen it. I know exactly what you're talking about. But we got to keep in mind too. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about how important balance is in everything that we do. When anything gets out of balance, you got a problem. And the sad part about it is that, and I can't think of a better word than some crooks did some very unfortunate things and got us into having to even come up with a Dodd-Frank. It just, and so I think probably what happened in an effort to try to prevent it from happening again, we found ourselves in this situation. So I can appreciate everything you said. I can also appreciate what you said, Mr. Williams and Mr. Rittenberg. Because, as you were talking, Mr. Rittenberg, I could not help but feel a little bit emotional because when you talk about lead paint, I think about all the children that I grew up with, and many of whom inhaled lead paint, and many of whom their development was retarded or arrested, and they never grew up to be what God meant for them to be. Some of them are sitting in prisons right now. Some of them were put in special ed never to escape, and their lives were stolen from them. Their futures were stolen from them. And to be very frank with you, I mourn for them every day. And it's still going on. But again, I go back to what I said to Mr. Hamby. It's a thing of balance, and I know, and it's a thing of practicality. And the quotes that the chairman just put up there, this administration has recognized that there are problems, and this administration has done probably more than any other administration trying to address those issues. President Obama has had a balanced approach towards regulations. He's focused on identifying regulations that are unnecessarily burdensome to business, and even issued several executive orders directing agencies to modify or repeal any existing regulations that are unnecessarily burdensome. The President has also finalized several key regulations that are critical to curb dangerous business practices or reduce harmful pollutants and toxins in our environment. The benefit of these rules far outweigh the cost, and their implementation is critical to the health and safety of Americans. Yes, Mr. Rudenberg, because I want you to be brief because I got something else I want to say.
I'll be brief. NHB has policy on record in support of protection against lead. My spouse has spent 20-something years in special education as a speech-language pathologist. I understand it. Our problem is with the implementation and execution. The rules were promulgated based upon the assumption that there would be a Phase 2 test kit available in August of 2010. It's still not available. That's the one that's giving us false readings.
Mr. Rudenberg, I want you to be clear. I'm not going against you. I think that we've got a test kit that is inaccurate. We need to deal with that.
Yes, sir.
And I 100% with you on that.
And we're with you.
Yeah, and the problem is that at the same time, though, I've got kids that I want to protect, and I've got folks who, again, may never grow up to be, to have to do what they were intended to do when they came upon this earth. But let me just tell you another little thing. Another reason why, whenever we have these hearings, I always think about when I was a kid in high school. I worked at Bethlehem Steel, and during the summer, and when you would go to Bethlehem Steel, Mr. Williams, if you've been there for about, when you're there, and I didn't think of it as a kid, you're just having fun, you're making a few dollars, you're getting a check for the first time. I didn't think about it then, but now I look back at it. When you were there for about 30 minutes, if you blew your nose, black or red mucus came out in 30 minutes. And there was no, I know of a requirement to have a mask over your face. And I mean, this is just from walking around the grounds. And so, you know, and then I think about all the people who have died, who I know have died, lung cancer. And they were making, now these guys were making a lot of money, but they died early. And so, I mean, I think, you know, when we talk about regulations, first of all, I want to make sure that we're fair to this president, that he has done what he can to try to address this problem. As I said in my opening statement, has slowed down the process of approving all these regulations and acknowledged that there's a problem. But at the same time, I just want to point out that there is also this benefit to regulations. I think that's what you were trying to say, Ms. Williams. I had 50 million questions. My time has run out. But I just wanted to say that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And thank you to the panel for being here. So many questions could be asked with so little time. Mr. Yarossi, EPA has issued a proposed rule to reclassify coal ash, as you've indicated, as a hazardous waste. How much will this reclassification increase costs for the transportation sector alone?
ARTBA's study has indicated it will cost $104 billion, about $5.4 billion a year over the next 20 years. Just to put that in context, the bill that was just passed reduced funding for highways by $2 billion a year from what it was at the 2009 levels. If you add that onto it, then we have a significant reduction in our ability to improve our transportation systems. Yeah.
How does the transportation sector use coal ash? Just describe it for us.
It's used in many ways, but primarily coal ash is used as a material in cement.
Does it perform any specific function as a specific material that's used? Does it replace something else?
Well, yeah, sure, absolutely. The EPA, and I'm going to look at my statistics here, that is estimated that using coal ash at the levels we're using them now results in annual greenhouse gas reductions in concrete of between 12.5 and 25 million tons. So that it is actually helping in the reduction of greenhouse gases. It also helps make concrete more durable and stronger, so we get a longer life out of our product.
And it's a waste product that's being used in a very useful, important function.
Yes.
And the cost factor savings as well. How will transportation sector deal with increased costs if this proposed rule goes through?
Yeah, that again is going to fall back onto the owners, and that would be varied widely, but I would have to imagine there will be less projects out there. The cost of building anything will go up, and the amount of money, until we see some new revenue coming into the transportation system, the answer, I think, is easy. There will be less projects going on.
So less jobs?
Less jobs.
Less economic opportunity in the future as well. The rule, as I understand it, will not only increase our utility costs, but it has an adverse impact, utility costs, as a result of disposing of this byproduct of coal. But it has an adverse impact as well on commercial value of coal ash. Mr. Yarossi and Mr. Ruttenberg, if I could ask you, how much coal ash do your industries use?
I don't have that figure with me.
A lot of it?
A lot. Here I do. In 2008, I have a figure. Again, I'm going back to my facts here. 12.5 million tons of coal ash was used in the production of concrete.
Okay. Significant amount.
A lot.
That would have to be disposed of some other way.
Exactly. Yes. Yes, sir.
Mr. Ruttenberg.
I do not have the number, but I will tell you that it is used extensively and that it varies by region and by specific ready-mix plant and how they do their concrete mix. So it varies, but we use a lot of it.
On drywall, for instance, I mean, how would the construction continue for that, maintain construction? How would the cost be affected without coal ash as a?
We're using the byproducts from scrubbers on coal plants to be, we call it synthetic drywall. That's my personal label. It may not be accurate. And it takes the place of mined gypsum, so it has a double benefit. It is, we no longer have to mine as much. We have a byproduct. We don't have to dispose of it. And in some plants, they will have cogeneration. They will actually locate the drywall plant with the coal power plant so they can use the steam as a byproduct to run the drywall plant.
Okay. Let me ask a further question on coal ash. Mr. Yarsi, can you talk about how EPA studied the issue of whether coal ash should be regulated as a hazardous waste in the past and the conclusion that they reached?
I do know that on 4 separate occasions, EPA has studied coal ash and determined that it didn't warrant regulation as a hazardous waste. 1988, 1993, 1999.
That it didn't warrant regulation
as
hazardous waste.
It did not warrant regulation as a hazardous waste.
Has anything changed to merit the EPA's change?
Not to my knowledge. There's no change in any scientific information that would warrant change.
Thank you. My time has expired. I recognize Mr. Kucinich. Oh, excuse me, Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for your testimony. You know, I don't object to having a hearing in any one of these areas here, and I think we all understand that there's a tension, natural tension, between a consumer and a producer, between a person working in the job and the boss on all of that around safety concerns, whatever. So we ought to have these hearings to make sure whatever rules are out there are fair, they're being enforced fairly, they make sense. And so any one of these subjects would be a pretty good hearing in and of themselves. What I sort of do object to, Mr. Chairman, is that we got a spray of 6 people in 6 different industries. Everybody gets about 5 minutes to sort of delve down a little bit, and you don't get any counter-arguments because we've got about a 5-to-1 ratio here of perspective. And I think what would be healthy is take any one of these subjects and bring on a much more even balance of people so we get the full array of opinion here and perspective and see whether or not there's something wrong with a given rule on that. I don't think anybody here thinks that we should have unfair things. I've been in business for over 20 years, represented a ton of businesses, and spent a lot of my life arguing about rules and regulations on that. Yet I think there should be rules and regulations. I would bet that everybody on this panel thinks that there ought to be some standards. In fact, you know, 3 national business organizations took a poll recently, and the top problem with the economy right now, in their perspective anyway, isn't rules and regulations. Those are things that constantly aggravate people and have to deal with it. But their problem is a lack of demand. I mean, if I go around my community and say, what's wrong? I say, I don't have any customers. You know, people are out of work. They don't have the money to spend. They don't have any customers. 78% of small business people think that government standards are important to level the playing field between their business and big business. 86% think they're a necessary part of a modern economy. 84% say they support food safety standards. And you talk to any group of people out in my neighborhood, talk to mothers and fathers, you know, around the playground and everything like that, they're worried about what kind of food is being imported and not checked. They're worried about toys coming in and not being checked. Those are legitimate standards on that. They're worried about you know, clean air and clean water. I grew up in Salem. We used to have the North River run right down the center of Salem. It was purple and blue and green and noxious, and we lived over a half a mile away. We couldn't sit on our deck. I think it was a good idea to get some standards to clean that up. And now Salem's a vibrant community. You don't smell any of that stuff going down there. People are boating and enjoying the water. So the issue, I think, here is not that we shouldn't have hearings on that to make sure the rules and regulations are effective. It's this notion of putting it under an umbrella that regulations are killing our economy or they're killing our job creators or whatever. It's just total nonsense. I don't think there's an iota of evidence that we've either heard today or that exists out there for this larger notion. I mean, we've sat in here in this Congress on that theory and talked about mercury emissions from power plants as somehow being job killers. We're talking about a 1990 bipartisan amendment to legislation, the Clean Air Act, The bipartisan legislation ordered the EPA to set standards. 17 states adopted it on their own. There's 772 million pounds of airborne toxics out there. I would think that none of these witnesses want to be sucking it in at 2.5 pounds per person on that basis. 20 years it took for the EPA to get to dealing with that issue. And even when it gets passed, it hasn't passed yet, it's going to take 4 more years, give 4 more years for people to get ready to implement it. It's, 31,000 construction jobs will be created, 9,000 continuing jobs in the utility industry, and yet we're arguing like it benefits are 25 times the cost of that in terms of health, and 160,000 lives will be saved. What are we arguing about in terms of that? We have hearings on that instead of the things that these gentlemen bring to the table. We limit toxic emissions from a variety of cement on that, as if the cement thing is going to pack up and go to China if it doesn't get its way on this basis. But, those are chemical compounds that do contribute to smog and pollution. And for every dollar we put in on enforcing that rule to clean those up, we get about $19 back in a public health benefit. We're talking about the import of illegally harvested endangered wood for guitars. This is what we spend our time on, not with the building industry, which has some serious concerns on that, not whether the LEED is the good example or whether we have other standards that should be brought in and why, not on the banking industry, what's happening to our community banks versus people on Wall Street that basically brought this country and almost the international community to their knees. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about guitars, which incidentally made $1 billion under the so-called onerous restriction of not letting them bring in illegal imported wood. We talk about, we had a hearing here on invasive foreign snakes. Now, there's something really slowing down the community. The evidence was one person in Utah who said in 2010 he had to lay off 4 of his 7 employees, in 2008 rather. Of course, 2008 was the height of the recession, and the rule he was complaining about didn't get put in until 2010. But this we had a hearing on. So it's not the fact that we shouldn't have these hearings. This is what this committee should be doing, and all of these are legitimate concerns. We can come down on one side or the other, but we ought to have a full hearing on those that we think are important enough to impact the economy so that it takes Congress's attention. Not the nitpicking stuff that are left to lawyers and experts that are going to go in front of the rules agencies and argue whether or not it should be amended or changed one way or the other, but the ones that make substantial public policy that really do make a difference, and then have a full hearing on all of that with enough perspective in there that we can all get a reasonable decision made as to what's good and what's bad. Really, I think the problem with the majority here is when they acknowledge that that's not really the problem, that the problem is a lack of demand and a lack of customers, then they're going to have to put some attention on the American Jobs Act and get people back to work, in excess of 1.9 million people back to work in a very short relative order on that. And that's their problem. So they have to look for something else to rail about and have to entitle hearings like this with a broad notion that, it's a job killers and job creators and that stuff. Let's do our job. Let's have a hearing on each of these things that are important in their own respect and in their industries that maybe do impact the economy, not bring in a show of 6 people, give them barely any time to make their case or have anybody rebut it so that they can get deeper into the weeds, and we can do our job in that way. And with that, I
thank the gentleman. His time has expired, and a good history lesson, but we'll have opportunities for plenty of hearings, I'm sure, in building the economy. I now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Lankford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This conversation about red tape is really a big deal. I don't think anyone on this dais or on this panel would disagree that there is an appropriate role for the Federal Government and for State and local governments in setting boundaries and regulations. But there has been a shift, it seems. The increased use of guidance documents rather than actually doing formal rulemaking, so that a guidance hangs out there and doesn't go through all the comment period to make changes. The major rules are now supplemented there, and we have more major rules with $100 million effect on the country than we've had before. The congressional intent is not being able to be evaluated. It's why bills like UMRA that this committee dealt with last year, the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act, is such a big deal. Let me get a chance to bounce off a few questions off a few of you in the time that I have here. Mr. Hamby, I want to ask you a little bit about Dodd-Frank. There was a lot of conversation about Dodd-Frank. It doesn't apply to community banks, that this applies to the big banks. So when Dodd-Frank comes down, does it have any effect on you as a community bank?
Oh, it absolutely does. We were just talking about the qualified mortgage that the gentleman, Mr. Ruthenberg, was talking about. That's going to be dramatic for us. If this is not monitored and this part of the bill is not watched very closely, we could come out with a dinosaur, basically, that we can't manage. It can be extremely complex. It can take us out of the business. Parts of that are designed. I understand why it was written. I understand why it's designed. It's all good intentions. But when you go down and you look at the small community where the average mortgage is $30,000 to $50,000, the cost is the same to make that mortgage as it is a $500,000 mortgage.
Okay, so we have a $50,000 mortgage,
right,
with a tremendous cost burden now that's been added to it. Give me just a thought here on a home loan application. Going through the process of that, has there been a change in the past couple of years in the home loan process? The length of time it takes, the difficulty of making the loan.
Oh, sure. 5 years ago, I was closing mortgage loans in 10 to 15 days and probably having documents about an inch thick. Now it takes me 40 to 45 days, and the documents are about 3 inches thick. I don't know anyone that reads all the documents because they really can't. And they used to read them, but they're hugely burdensome to the consumer. We want to do what's right. We want to make sure they're protected. We want to make sure they understand the terms and the conditions. I'm a big consumer advocate on that. But the way we have it done, we're killing a lot of trees. We're hiring a lot of regulators. I'm hiring a lot of lawyers, and I don't think the people are any better protected.
What effect does this have on a smaller bank?
Well,
you're a community bank as well, but let's take a bank of $500 million or less, or $50 million or less assets.
Sure. Let's take a little bank out in the rural area of the country that's a $50 million bank.
Okay.
With all the hoops they have to go through to make the mortgage loan and to make sure they're doing it right and they're in compliance with Dodd-Frank, if the qualified mortgage rule gets enacted improperly, it very well will take them out of the mortgage lending market. And they're the only person that makes a loan to people in small rural communities. There isn't any big Wells Fargo or anyone like that to do it out there. It's simply too small. And so they do it. There aren't good appraisals. You know, you have to, when you get an appraisal, you have to have comp values, at least 3 in the last 6 months. Well, if you're in a small town and the average home price is $50,000 and you have a $100,000 home, you're not going to find 3 comparative values in 6 months. So you're not going to meet Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae guidelines. And so the bank is going to make the loan. It's probably going to be adjustable every 5 years. It's not going to be going out to the secondary market where you can get the 2.85% interest. And then part of the rule is to watch what's called the high price mortgage. It will fall in that category, and that will further take away from the community bank's ability to serve that customer who wants to finance his home or build his home. It's a real issue for community banks.
You're saying in community banks in rural America, this solution that was put out there really was a solution for urban areas and for deal with larger banks, but for the community banks in the smaller areas, all those burdens are coming down on them.
Absolutely, a lot of them are, and it can be very devastating. You know, it's the rule of unintended consequences.
How many staff did you have to hire, or how many dollars did you have to spend last year dealing with just compliance? Just compliance.
Last year, I can't tell you the total dollar I spent on just compliance, but as I said, it increased in the last 3 years by $1.4 million. It is now the
just the increase, because as you mentioned before, the banks are some of the most regulated industry in America.
That's right.
Lots of regulations already. Right. But in addition to the regulations that have been there for a long time, you had an additional $1.4 million in cost?
An additional $1.4 million of cost. Right now, regulatory compliance is my 3rd largest expense item. The first is interest expense. The second one is human resources expense. And then the third one, which used to be a way down the line, is now regulatory compliance expense.
One quick question.
Yes, sir.
The Volcker Rule and several other rules that are not supposed to apply to community banks, do you have to prove that it doesn't apply to you, or is it just automatic? If it's your certain size, it doesn't apply to you?
Oh, you're going to have to prove it doesn't apply to you.
So how long does it take to prove that this rule doesn't apply to you?
Well, I don't know yet, but I'm sure I'm going to get the privilege of finding out.
It's a long process, though.
It's a long process, yes. Okay. The community advisor rule, I mean, let's talk about that for 1 second while we're on that. A community advisor rule says if you give advice to counties or municipalities, you need to have a registered advisor. Well, to have a registered advisor, we understand that. But the definition of the regulation has come down now that it's anyone that talks to them about it. The teller who says you may want to look at a CD has to be a registered advisor. Anyone that does it. The same thing right now, you have to register all mortgage originators. Well, that's fine. We have 5 in our bank that originate mortgages. But when it came down through regulation, it's anyone that in any possible manner talks about the rate on a mortgage. I have registered, and so have every one of my officers, every one of my secretaries, anyone that touches a loan, my administration clerks. I've registered about 28 or 30 people, paid fees, fingerprinted, keep up with it, as mortgage originators, even though they don't have the slightest thing to do with mortgage origination.
Thank you for that. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. The time has expired. I now recognize the gentlelady from D.C., Ms. Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for Mr. Williams, but I was taken by Mr. Russell's testimony, and I'd like to ask him a question first, because it has always seemed to me that one way to eliminate the public notion that businesses are always for regulations for the general good until the first regulation appears is for the industry to set up its own standard and invite the government to use it. So I was taken by your testimony about the LEED standard, and you say in your testimony that it is one of several private sector green building systems that help drive reductions in energy use in public and private sector buildings. So you do understand that as a landlord and as a lessor or lessee, that the federal government has an interest in driving down the costs. Now, let's go to LEED. I take it that LEED was a pioneer in this green technology. Is that why LEED is, we always hear LEED used?
Yes, Congressman, LEED is one, but there were others that have developed alongside.
Yeah, but LEED was probably, you know, whoever gets there first probably gets an advantage, and I can understand your concern. But understand what interests me is that GSA didn't go and figure out its own regulations. It looked to see what was best practices. And who did it turn to? It turned to private industry. And so it chose LEED. And you want them to choose a number of different standards. And you say that the LEED standard is being revised in a way that could jeopardize U.S. jobs. Has GSA said it approves of the revisions and will continue with the LEED standards with revisions being made?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. That's precisely the point. The GSA has undertaken, as it is required to do, a review of green building rating systems and has compared several of them side by side. And in fact, in many cases, GSA's review, their own review, found that another building standard was preferable in certain of the criteria.
And so what did it do in that case?
Well, the review is ongoing and is not complete yet. But GSA, until today, has recommended for Federal buildings under the scope of its recommendation that they use exclusively LEED.
All right. So the review is ongoing. We had LEED, which was the first, and it did something that it seems to me we'd like to see done more often. And now you're saying they're reviewing a number of standards. They haven't said they won't use a number. Now that a lot of people have understood that it's good business to be green, we now have lots of companies. That's the American way, saying we can have standards as well, and our standards are just as good, and our standards are particularly befitting American industry. GSA hasn't said it won't use these standards. It's reviewing those standards now that there are more actors in this area. Well, you don't contradict that.
So I'm sorry. I was waiting. I assumed you were distracted. My apologies. I would like to respond in that the version of LEED that GSA currently requires exclusively was a version of LEED that has existed until now. LEED's proposed regulations are those which we have been questioning as hurtful to our industry and perhaps also.
Well, so government is doing it the right way. They're proposing the regulations. They're reviewing the regulations. You even say that in the DOE headquarters they used a roof, or they used cool vinyl roofing that you approved of.
DOE has a special exemption, and we're able to do that. That roofing, however, would not be available to DOE.
Okay. Well, I just want to put on the record, Mr. Russell, that they are reviewing, that there now are more actors in the field, and that's what happens when they see LEED getting all the business. you have people saying, me too, and I don't see how there can be objection to that, particularly if they are under review. Mr. Williams, you are in a business that ought to know a lot about LEED, and you say that you have created 94 jobs since July 2008, and so I have to ask you first your view of LEED and how there might be other systems as well that should be used, and also how you were able to increase your business, including a new business startup apparently, while complying with regulations, and why regulations didn't hinder you, or if they did, or make it more difficult. I wish you'd explain how.
All right, thank you. Yes, I do have some expertise in that, in as much as I am a LEED accredited professional. And I think as such, there are a few things. Certainly, Chairman Issa, in his comment, as he spoke about the GSA wanting to lease buildings where all utilities are included, and that's problematic. I agree with him on that, and so does the U.S. Green Building Council. The U.S. Green Building Council really wants the tenant to pay the utilities, because then the tenant is responsible for being responsible. Secondly, I think it's really important to note that LEED version 3 is what is in operation today. LEED version 4 is what is being considered. No versions of LEED 3 or 4 rule out any product out of a building. Unequivocal. LEED version 4 brings into play 2 material and resource credits that deal with the chemistry of materials. A building can be built and not even use or require the use of those 2 credits. The bulletproof glass is still going to be used as bulletproof glass until such time as there are alternatives or a architectural owner group that wants to use the material and resource, those options within the material and resource credits. The jobs that we've been able to create have been because of our position vis our customers. Our customers are asking for building products with certain attributes. We very early on invested in those products with those attributes that actually today position our materials to be well chosen in version 4, but again, do not make our materials exclusive for version 4. So our work in the environment, particularly in the environment within the building construction area, is what has allowed us to grow through customer demand. Our business growth, 2011 over 2010, was 20%. No segment of our economy that I'm aware of grew 20% at that time, and the building sector did not grow 20% at that time. We're responding largely to customer demand, and understanding and translating those customer demands are what has allowed us to create jobs as opposed to issues dealing with regulation. We are regulated, and we know there are times when that can be problematic, but that's not what I came today to talk about. I came today to talk about our business has grown in this economy, and that is why our business has grown in this economy. And Representative Issa, you may have missed a comment that I'd made, and it is that the U.S. Green Building Council would strongly agree with you relative to a tenant leasing where the utilities are included in the lease. The U.S. Green Building Council very specifically wants the tenant to pay for their water and their electricity so that they're aware of what they're using, so that they're better stewards of that.
And we're going to work on getting GSA to see the light. And with that, we recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar. Is there a disagreement on who's next? Mr. Gosar.
Well, thank you, Chairman. Being from Arizona, we really understand where this is heading, and I'm also a health care professional. You know, that we have to believe that there are rules and regulations that we have to look at, but government a lot of times is the problem. It's called that knee-jerk reaction. Instead of conscientiously looking at the problem and sorting it out. How does that Hippocratic oath go? Do no harm. You know, we find that over and over again. I want to direct my first question to Mr. Ruttenberg. In your testimony, you mentioned that a National Association of Home Builders, NAHB, Housing Market Index survey conducted in January of 2012 found that 69% of builders reported that qualifying buyers for mortgages is a significant problem for them. Why is this the case?
It's the same. It's a continuation of what we've talked about, how the banks are becoming very cautious, that they're having loans sent back to them by the Fannie, Freddie, and other GSEs, that to be defensive, the average loan set of documents now exceeds 500 pages. The length of time has grown so long, the appraisals have become a problem. We have Secretary Donovan said in April when I was in a meeting with him that he believes that the pendulum in the housing finance has swung too far the opposite way. It needs to come back in the middle. Whenever we've had problems, we tend to overreact. We've overreacted. And now if we can come back into the middle, it would be much better. We could give a good, the protection that we need, and we could focus back on what's pragmatic.
So a closer analogy, when I was going healthcare, instead of using a cleaver with these, we should have used a scalpel.
It would be as if you sent almost everybody for a CT or an MRI.
Or brain surgery, instead of maybe a dose of antibiotic. That's what I get. Mr. Hambley, would you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I would.
Do you think CFBP is on the right track?
They are in some instances, sir. In others, they are not. I think we have to be very careful about how it's implemented. The concerning things are really that there's no oversight board for them, and there's really no budgetary constraints. It's a czar system, which is concerning in itself. But we must be diligent. This committee needs to be diligent to make sure that things like the qualified mortgage that we're talking about are sensible, usable, and do not cause more problems than they create.
Well, and I'm very concerned about it. Being from Arizona, last year, we ranked second in foreclosures again. So, the housing market is a huge industry for Arizona as well as the nation. So your ability to do you think they are on the right track in regards to the ability for the repay rule?
I think it's too early, quite honestly, to say yet, but I think we should look at it very cautiously.
If they're not on the right track, how would you say they go about getting back on the right track?
Well, the right track is to sit down with all the industries, the trade associations, go over it, reach a consensus between everybody as to how we accomplish the goal, and at the same time make sure that our mortgage market thrives and continues to work well.
And it also would, I think, include the community bankers, would it not?
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm from rural Arizona. And
absolutely, sir.
That's what makes 99% of our loans out in rural Arizona.
Yes, sir, and that's why I'm pleased to be able to testify today.
And thank you for being here. How would you feel about that, Mr. Ruttenberg, as part of that repay rule?
I think that we have to be very careful. I'm very concerned that we're going to see the rules for the first time in December, and they're supposed to be implemented in January. That we wish we would be more active in the conversations, as you alluded to. One of the things for the qualified mortgage, we very much support the safe harbor as opposed to rebuttable. We believe that they need to be prescriptive, pragmatic, and something that lenders can do and feel comfortable in, and when they have the comfort, we will see lending become more abundant.
I know I'm going to kind of skip ahead here because I'm limited on time. In regards to, I put myself through school as a contractor builder, so I understand a lot of that aspects. One of the things is the A, D, and C type of loans in regards to contractors buying and financing a house and a start. Tell me, how do you see revamping that, or do you see that as being the ability to kind of jumpstart our economy in home building?
There's no question that the small, medium-sized builders need A, D, and C to be able to compete with the larger builders, that they're getting their money directly from the large banks and from Wall Street. The regulators in many parts of the country, in your state, in my state, I'm sure in my state, just tell the banks you cannot do any more lending. You have to continue to shrink your real estate assets. And so the banks are not able to loan to the builders. It's become almost non-existent. And it is starting to ease up just a little bit, but not enough to take care of the demand because the inventory of new homes is at an all-time historic low, both percentage and by units.
Mr. Hambley, I'm going to take one more second. The analogy was always made to me that sometimes it's that loan that's made in tough times, probably with not the right information or the best information, that actually is the best loan given. Is that something that you would agree with, that a community bank is much more apt to be able to make that right decision?
Yes, sir, I would, and many times that is exactly the case. Not always, but most of the time. It gets to the character issue I talked about earlier and the judgment call that we make.
It's that area looking in their eye and understanding exactly the fortitude about how they're going to repay that.
We know what they're going to do. We understand our community. We know what the impact to the community will do, and we have a pretty good feel as if it will work or not.
The gentleman's time has expired. I thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd also ask that my opening statement be entered into the record at this point.
Without objection, all members' opening statements will be placed in the record, and we'll hold the record open until the end of the day for any additional statements.
I thank the Chair. And just two other items. I have a statement from the Virginia forest products industry that is signed by 24 private sector companies in the forest products business, the lumber business, hardwood flooring business, and the forestry business, who in fact favor the Lacey Act and want to see its full implementation, because from their point of view, actually it protects them, legitimate industry, from illegal logging and the marketing of products from illegal logging. So I'd at least like to get from the Commonwealth of Virginia's perspective, the Virginia forest industry's perspective in favor of the Lacey Act regulation, and to their letter entered into the record.
Without objection, that will be placed in the record.
I thank the Chair. And just one other item. Also have a letter addressed to
you're on a roll. You're doing real well with these.
Addressed to yourself, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, from Transwestern Sustainability Services. And again, this is a letter by a very large company that's done 20 million square feet with 100 LEED certified buildings in favor of LEED certification, and quite explicit in saying that it is not a job killer. And just to get the other point of view, I would also ask that their letter addressed to you and Mr. Cummings be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Would
the gentleman agree that regardless of whether it's a job killer or not, LEED is one of multiple standards for greening up buildings?
Going to get there. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. As somebody, well, let me first say, one of the problems I think we have, this is our 28th hearing on the subject of regulation, and frankly, as the Chairman knows, I wish we could have neutrally worded titles for hearings, because I actually think there's a lot of bipartisan concern about regulations that go too far, regulations with the best of intention that have bad results, regulations that do make it hard to do business. And remember, it's not just business. I ran a local government, one of the largest local governments in America, and we were subject to regulation, federal regulation or state regulation, that sometimes made no sense, or just had us do incredible expenditures for very little gain. And you think, is there any common sense left on the planet? Everybody with the best of intention, but gone amok. So there's a lot of sympathy for that point of view, but there won't be sympathy for the point of view that all regulation is bad, all regulation is a job killer, and that's the solution if we're worried about high unemployment. You heard the passionate statement of our ranking member, Mr. Cummings, about what it's like in an inner city in America to look at the results of lead poisoning. And if you're a parent who has a kid who's been a victim of lead poisoning, you want more regulation, not less. Mr. Tierney from Massachusetts was talking about this dialectic. There's a famous town in Massachusetts that was devastating because of illegal chemical toxic dumping. Many, many cancer deaths, children. And so they wanted protection. I don't think there's an easy way out of looking at the financial meltdown on Wall Street, though I understand it's arguable, where a reasonable person would not conclude that the problem wasn't overregulation of the financial industry. No less a figure than Mr. Greenspan testified subsequently to that and admitted he had made a mistake. So I don't think it's an either-or proposition. But let me talk about LEED, because, Mr. Russell, you said it was a job killer, and, Mr. Rittenberg, it's your business. And I've worked with the home builders in my community and developers, and I agree with the Chairman that sometimes LEED is so rigid that it actually helps defeat the goal we're trying to achieve. Having said that, does not lead also sometimes create jobs and give somebody a competitive advantage by marketing a product saying, I'm LEED certified. Mr. Rittenberg.
Well, LEED certainly helped create an industry and advance the cause of energy conservation, which I've personally been working on since the 70s, and I applaud that. However, there are other standards that have become involved and should see the light of day. The home builder spent several $1,000,000 developing a green building standard before we spun it off. I'd like to point out it's the only standard that was an ANSI standard by the National Standard Industry, and LEED participated in our consensus for it. And it's also going through other evolutions. And I think we did it because we thought we could deliver a better product for less money to the consumer. And I hope they get the light. If I can go for just about another 15 seconds on the lead paint before I get into trouble, I want to point out that the exemption that we asked for until we had the right kits was for homes that had no children and could not have a pregnant woman. It was very specific to where it would be safe. We continue to be on record in favor of lead paint abatement.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that Mr. Russell be allowed to answer.
Thank you, Congressman.
I would ask unanimous consent the gentleman have an additional minute. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Connolly, to be very clear, the testimony we presented to the committee is not intended to be interpreted that any particular system is a job killer, LEED included. The testimony is intended to illustrate that the Federal Government's selection of one and only one from among many, including many that have been demonstrated by the government's own assessment to perform better, perhaps also including my colleague to the left's system, would be an opportunity for the government to become more efficient and save money, and toward outcomes that we all share, which are increased energy efficiency and higher building performance. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if there's just 15 or 20 seconds, I think Mr. Williams also was seeking. Were you seeking to do? All right. I thank the Chair for the extra time.
I thank the gentleman. I would now ask unanimous consent that the following statement from page 48 of our report be placed in the record. The settlement agreement required EPA to propose and finalize a new rule to remove the opt-out provision. On June 7, 2012, bipartisan legislation, the LEED Exposure Reduction Act of 2012 was introduced to restore the opt-out provision pursuant to the settlement. Just in case anyone wanted to make sure they understood that lead paint is not an issue that is partisan. And with that, we go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I start, I would like to enter in on the record a letter from the Associated Builders and Contractors. Let me just be
without objection, so ordered.
Yeah, and it says at the start of this, the first paragraph, on behalf of the Associated Builders and Contractors, a national association with 74 chapters representing 22,000 merit shop construction and construction-related firms. I just want to make sure we understand that, because as I heard earlier, we only have 6 people here, and we could probably stay here for weeks, and we could probably bring in not just 6 of you, but 6,000 of you that would have the same concerns. And I think that's what probably bothers me more than anything else. This hearing is not zip code specific. This hearing is not industry specific, and this hearing is certainly not politically specific. When I'm walking in the 3rd District of Western Pennsylvania, to a person, everybody I talk to talks about the crushing boot the government puts on the throat of small business people. And if they would just let off a little bit, maybe we could grow jobs. Maybe we could go ahead and expand an economy that's only being held back by us internally. There's no place else in the world like this. My goodness, we're awash in natural resources. We're a gift from God, and we can't even get to them because of overregulation. And so when I hear this, I got to, Mr. Hamby especially, you remind me of so many people that I talk to in Northwest Pennsylvania, people that have small banks. You and I talked just briefly. Tell me about the qualified borrower definition. And it's a definition, this is CFPB, right? And how many pages is it, by the way, the definition?
Well, I'll be honest, I really don't know yet.
It's 1,001 pages. The definition of who a qualified buyer is. Now, I'm going to assume that in Ada, Oklahoma, where you grew up, that you probably walk those same streets, go to the same churches, go to the same restaurants, the same schools, and so those people that come in and sit across the desk from you are probably people you know and know whether they're qualified or not qualified?
Absolutely.
So does somebody from Washington have to give you 1,001 pages to define what a qualified borrower is?
No, sir.
Does it make it a little bit tough to make your decision?
Yes, sir, it does. Our lending standards are the same they have been for the last 30 years. All we have to do now is do a lot more documentation, a lot papering on the same thing that we're
Okay, so when we talk about a lot more, what does it actually mean? It's a dollars and cents thing, is it not?
It's a dollars and cents thing. As I reported earlier, it's a dollars and cents thing, and more than that, it's a time thing for my staff. It takes their eye off the ball, which is taking care of the customer. Instead, we're focused on complying with all the regulations and all the hoops that we have to go through instead of getting out there and telling people, hey, it's time to refinance your home, or how can I help you?
Yeah, and a lot of these regs are not based on solid evidence, but they're on conjecture and speculation. They're lacking foundation in any type of sound scientific analysis. Is that not true?
I believe you're correct, sir.
Okay. I think the confusing thing of this is, when we talk about, and Mr. Tierney said, the problem is there's a lack of demand. There's a lack of demand because people aren't certain of what's happening to them. Every one of you represent an industry or a business that cannot move forward because you just don't know what's going to happen to you next. It holds you back. Now, I know from being in my business, I'm in the automobile business, when I'm not here, and thank God I'm not here all the time. I get back home to Northwest Pennsylvania, I listen to people. When I'm on the lot or I'm on the showroom, there are people I sit across from that want to buy a car or a truck, but they can't do it. And you know why they can't? Because they're not sure that they're going to have a job, or they're going to have a job that's going to pay at the rate that they need to meet a payment for the next 48 or 60 months. And I think, Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing, because it does come down to how difficult it is. The title of this is Job Creators Still Buried by Red Tape. Is there anybody sitting at this table that would say to me, you know what, we don't have enough regulations, we just need a few more? Anybody? Anybody sit there would say, you know, some of the regulations we have right now, could you not produce a list of regulations that absolutely have no intrinsic value to the ultimate user or the consumer? And every one of these regulations adds cost to your final product. I don't care if you're lending money, selling a car, building a house, working in the chemistry business, the chemical business, whatever it is. This all drives your cost of your final product up, does it not? So when there's a price increase, unless I've been missing things for the last 40-some years that I've been on the lot, every time the price of something goes up, what does it eliminate? The lowest person on the totem pole. It takes them out of the market. So if we're really concerned about creating jobs, wouldn't it be great to allow you to actually move around in a free market and be able to run your business with some type of certainty? Anybody disagree with that? I mean, I really want to hear from you, because I've heard so much about how these regulations don't hurt and don't affect cost. Nobody.
I would say that in the areas of business in which we are regulated, we can move freely within our marketplace. It may be an exception, but we can move freely within the marketplace, and the consumer demand for what we're doing is such that it enables us to do that. Albeit, one could reasonably argue we're within a niche.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we're a small business, central Pennsylvania, and we're being successful.
And I understand. I'm in a small business in western Pennsylvania.
I'd ask unanimous consent the gentleman have one additional minute without objection, so ordered.
I would appreciate that. Yes, sir.
When you asked about regulations, one of the things I would like to add is that we are now starting to see a lot of guidance coming out from different agencies, which does not necessarily have the same scrutiny as a regulation before it's issued, and that is becoming a concern.
Okay. Well, let me just say this to you. This consumer, the CFPB, the people are coming up with a qualified borrower definition. I wonder if there's any chance of getting those directives or those guidance to the Department of Energy. Probably would have helped them in making some of the decisions of who they lent money to. It's ultimately cost the United States taxpayers a ton of money. Just as a final, I do appreciate you being here. But you know what we need to do? We need to do this. I don't care how many of these hearings we have. We need to do it every day, in every way, in every town that we represent, because you know what? The message isn't getting back here. And it's certainly not getting to this administration that continues to layer you with more regulations that ultimately drive the cost of whatever it is that you do higher and higher and higher. It It eliminates the business. It decreases demand. And when you decrease demand, you're also eliminating jobs. And if this is about creating jobs, then my goodness, we better start looking at where the problem is. I thank you so much. Chairman,
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentlelady from the Money Center banking community of America, New York, Ms. Maloney.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I also thank all the panelists for coming here today to share your personal experiences with running your businesses and really participating in the American economy. I am so tired of this recession. It's been going on since 2007, and according to most economists, it has cost this country $18 trillion in household wealth, well over 7 million jobs, and many economies have not even recovered. Yesterday, Bernanke testified that one area that now, after many years, is picking up is housing. And that's good news because Professor Zandi says that housing is 25% of our economy, our GDP. So without a robust housing market, our economy will remain sluggish. Now, many economists say that what caused this was lack of regulation. Lack of regulation for new products, lack of regulation for subprime loans, and part of the reforms is that a qualified buyer has to be someone who can afford the loan. I call that responsible. And if we'd had that common sense regulation in place prior to 2007, possibly we would have averted this financial crisis, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics says it's the first recession in our history that was totally caused by mismanagement of the financial system. So I would say some regulation that prevents economic downturns is well worth the effort to bring into sunshine, bring into transparency, at the very least have the ability to pay for whatever it is you're buying. During the crisis, the joke in New York was if you can't afford to pay your rent, go out and buy a home. It was that easy. And many people are suffering to this day because of it. And I would say that this financial crisis contributed to this lack of regulation, contributed to the economic downturn. So a regulation that has passed out of this committee that says that unemployment has to be below 6% before you can pass a regulation would nullify all the regulations we have there to prevent another financial crisis. It truly would. And I'd like to ask the panelists if you think it's reasonable to have some reforms there, such as the QE2 that we had a panel and some of your representatives testified before Financial Services that they supported these regulations, ability to pay and others, in order to prevent another economic downturn. So I'd like to ask Mr. Ruttenberg, do you think that reasonable reforms or regulations to prevent another subprime crisis are reasonable for growing jobs in the future? Do any of you want to go back to the Wild West days of any risk you want to take, you can take, and you can buy things without any intention of ever even paying for it, and it's sold on the secondary market that brings tragedy to our liquidity and to our capital in our country? Mr. Ruttenberg, would you support the rule that we're considering that you literally be able to pay for a house if you're buying it? That's one of the reforms. It's literally one of the reforms. You would think that's common sense, but some people are opposed to ability to pay. So I would like to say if that reform was in place, do you think the housing market would be stronger today? Possibly we would have averted the entire crisis.
The National Association of Home Builders has put out a paper and worked with Congress and the administration and Republican candidates suggesting some modifications to the housing finance system, which we believe are important and would go a long ways to providing more stability and safety to the system. So yes, we do believe there needs to be reforms. We do have questions about whether or not we need a 1,000-page definition of a qualified buyer, if that in fact is true, and some of the other things that may be proposed. So in general, we do think that it is time to evolve the system to make it better. We think that we should be responsible in the forms that we have, that we should be responsible in qualifying people, that bankers should be doing real banking, and that we should be more responsible. But I think we also want to be careful in what kind of regulations that we're opening the door for and make sure that they're reasonable and that they would be effective.
Do you support the qualification that you have the ability to pay before you buy a house?
We believe that, and we believe there should be a safe harbor, and there should be ways to that we think that there should be guidelines. I think we agree with where you're going. The question is, what does it look like when we have it, and if that works? And some things become counterproductive. If we go from a 300 to a 500 to an 800-page loan package, I don't think we've done a lot of good. We obviously, there's a ratio between prices of homes and income, and normally we've been about 3.2. Well, in some states we got up to 5.5. That's just stupid. You know, and people were doing things, and I had somebody who said they're flipping condo contracts like they used to do NASDAQ stocks. That's inappropriate, and that should be stopped.
Well, Mr. Williams, you testified that you created 94 new jobs. Congratulations. If every small business had done what you've done, we wouldn't have an unemployment problem. And since July 2008, an additional 29 at a new startup business. And do you believe that complying with regulations has hurt your business or caused your company in any way to lose jobs?
No, it has not.
And even you won an award, as I understand, an EPA award for environmental achievements. And you said your company's work on sustainable environment is good for your customers and good for business. So is it fair to say that your company has found that it's good business to be a leader in complying with energy and environmental regulations?
Yes, it is fair to say that. Just footnote, a very well-established environmental consulting group, 5 Winds International, years ago, developed a model that essentially said if regulation is always viewed as cost, it will always be cost. If regulation is viewed as opportunity, it can create opportunity and can even create competitive advantage. We subscribe to that. It was rather startling to us at first to work through that because it didn't seem to make sense to us. But ultimately, adopting that model has helped us to stay out front. And generally speaking, our consumers are asking sometimes more than what the regulations may be.
Well, we've heard that the current administration has imposed a regulatory tsunami on businesses. And have you noticed this regulatory tsunami in the last 3 years that we keep hearing about? Have you witnessed that, or has it been a burden to you?
There are some regulations that we may have gotten splashed by the tsunami, but we've not been overwhelmed by it. So in that respect, our industry sector may have, as I said, only been splashed, and none of which we encountered prevented us from moving forward.
Well, your presence here today can help convince, I hope, some of my colleagues that regulation and economic prosperity are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they can go hand in hand. And I would say that a good road map of how we're going to operate would help business, help the overall economy, and any regulation that you feel is too onerous or whatever, I think that your Congress member, and this committee, and others would like to look at it. But we don't want to go back to days when there was no regulation, and I'm particularly talking about the housing market, which to this day is suffering dramatically, and I would say is the major challenge that we now have in our economy is how to get housing back on track, creating jobs, and moving forward. So, Mr. Ruttenberg, do you have any ideas of how to get housing moving? I think the statement by Chairman Bernanke was encouraging yesterday. It was in response to my question, but he did say housing was one of the strongest economic indicators in the last economic report.
And I'd ask the gentlelady have an additional 20 seconds, making it an even 10 minutes. Without objection, so ordered.
What? 10 minutes?
Housing is now back to about 40% of its sustainable level of production. I would like to comment that the recent 3 or 4 year history of bank performance of the new loans has been quite excellent, and even in Fannie and Freddie that is true. NHB continues to try and be part of the process of reforming the regulations and improving them so that both our consumers and the financial institutions are in a better position. It's an ongoing, and we look forward to being part of the process. We're getting better slowly.
Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady. We now recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Platts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Coming from a HASC classified briefing, so I apologize for the late arrival. I want to thank the witnesses here and appreciate their written testimony and yield the balance of my time to you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Williams, since you only got splashed by the tsunami, I thought I'd ask a couple of more questions. And I appreciate your being a good witness here today. And I think we all agree that that within LEED certification standards and the efforts they're making lies something that everybody is trying to do. I happen to come from California, where a lot of what you choose to do under LEED, we led as a state. But I am concerned about the standardization or the lack of standardization that exists within the industry, where depending upon which standard you go to, you might have different choices. And if one organization like GSA mandates that, then by definition they're picking a winner. Would you agree that in the argument over Betamax versus Sony, so to speak, that the government should try to encourage and allow as many standards as they can so as not to determine the outcome of one versus the other? In other words, promote competition rather than mandating one solution.
I had the opportunity to play back or listen to the May hearings on that subject. And I think one of the things I heard there was performance standard. There are enough differences in several of the green building standards that adoption of or picking and choosing without that core base of performance standard, I think could lead the GSA down a very windy road.
But you mentioned that you support tenants paying for their water and electricity so that there is a causal relationship. Isn't it true that no matter what the GSA does in the way of defining standards, if the tenant is not responsible, they can abuse those standards? They can run their air conditioning at a lower temperature, they can do it 24 hours a day, they can leave the lights on, and so on.
Absolutely. And I think virtually every green building standard would say no to that, because that's not the core premise or the reason they exist.
Now I'm going to ask you a little bit of maybe more business personal questions. You have a line of mats in your company,
yes,
if I read it right. Where do you source them from?
There are two places. One line of mats has been made and is made here in the United States and has been made here since 1968. We also have a line that we source from our factory in China. And the core reason for that factory's existence in China is to have manufacturing base in China, not to take jobs out. The product that you reference is a product that if we're physically unable to make that here in the United States.
And why is that?
That is because of the configuration of the product and access to the particular materials. It is about $2 million per year of a $110 million business. It also provides the foundation for our startup in China. Our belief is that
and I don't want to cut you off. I want to give you all the time in the world. We're sort of at the end. But you made a decision because it was impossible to make something in the U.S. that led to $2 million worth of goods being produced in China. Can you just elaborate on that?
I was beginning to do that, so hopefully I'll make sense. I know you'll understand it. The question will be if I make sense.
I'm an old manufacturer, so I always want to know why something's made one place versus another.
Okay. The product is made there. It formed for us the basis of being able to set up a business in mainland China for the purpose of selling our products into mainland China. Many years ago, our founder returned from Saudi Arabia and spoke and said that growing our business in the Middle East was very important to him because he felt it was his patriotic duty to bring some of the oil dollars back to the United States. And he stood there with a great wide grin on his face, just as you grinned at it.
We love exporting, don't we?
Well,
when
yes,
we can.
big time, big time. And the basis of our factory in China is to reach that marketplace with our products and manufacturing in China, and to some degree, upon our founders' smiling comment, is to return dollars to the United States. And that niche of our product line being made in China is the foundation of starting that business in China, and us just bringing those products.
Right, but you didn't say that it was cheaper to make in China. You said you couldn't make it in the U.S., and I just wondered, is it that you couldn't make it cost effectively? In order to hit a price point in a global market, you chose to leverage some of your technology in China?
It's technology that was available to us in China, not here. We could replicate it. The price point on the product, candidly, is, I don't want to say there is no price point. It's the only product of its type. So the price point was not the issue. That was our decision around a core of being able to begin manufacturing in China.
Well, I'll just make a broad question for all of you. If, in fact, America has extremely low-cost energy, if America has a well-educated workforce available to you, if America has a good transportation infrastructure system, and if America has a tax policy that is competitive with any other country in the world, then, and a regulatory system that is as streamlined to protect while at the same time not interfering, then can your companies, your industries, maybe leave the banker out for a moment, compete? Now, last question. Do you believe we have all of those elements today, or can we and should we do better?
We absolutely should do better. We could do a lot better in how we can make a lot of those things work.
And Mr. Hamby, if I add access to affordable capital, would you also weigh in?
Sure. It would be a lot more affordable to help them with, and it would be more abundant.
Mr. Perkle.
Currently, I think we import about 60% of our fertilizer needs for the domestic agricultural market. So to balance that would be better for American jobs.
And low-cost fossil fuels such as natural gas is a major element to your being able to make it domestically.
That is correct.
Mr. Williams.
I think we can do better, absolutely convinced we can do better. And earlier, if I may, to your point on the trillion, I do think that's an area where Eisenhower's quote is so pertinent, that we have done so much to squander things for future generations. We talk about sustainability in the environment. We need a sustainable economy, and we need a sustainable America, and doing better is essential to that.
And I believe Eisenhower is the last president to balance budget in all his years. Mr. Russell.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We can do better. We look forward to working with the committee and making that a reality.
Thank you. Mr. Ruttenberg, you have the last word.
Well, my wife's an educator, and I'm all for improving education, and I look forward to infrastructure. I think we can do better. I think we have great promise, and I look forward to the future.
Thank you. And Mr. Platts, thank you for the use of your time. And with that, I want to thank the panel for being patient. I will note that finishing at the stroke of noon is practically a record for a panel this size. We stand adjourned.